now closed. The library is now closed. It will be open again tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. Obviously, we are still open for this special presentation. I'd like to thank Chief Scott Perkins and also Princess Samara for helping us put this together. Scott is Fallingwater's Director of Preservation and Collections and was previously the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at Price Tower Art Center in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, sorry. He has written on the Price Tower and Guggenheim Museum interiors, and his essay on Zaha Hadid's addition to the Price Tower appeared in Richard Longstreth's Frank Lloyd Wright Preservation Design and Adding to Iconic Buildings. He received his MA and his Master of Philosophy at Bard Graduate Center in New York City, and his BFA from the School of Art Institute in Chicago. And in 2015, he completed the National Historic Landmark application for the John Catherine Christian House, Samara. This is a free and public lecture that was sponsored by the O'Brien Lecture Series. I would like to have Scott come up and do this presentation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin and Nick, for the invitation. It's good to be back here. I thought I was, first of all, I asked the question, how many have been to Fallingwater? The rest of you, for a visit? I thought I'd start at least by kind of introducing the house and the family to you, so you have a little bit of an understanding of some of the things that affect our preservation efforts at Fallingwater. This was a house that was completed in 1937, and a guest house was added to the rear of the house, which is actually up the hill, in 1939. And it's presently on 5,100 acres of land, which is known as the Bear Run Nature Reserve, named after Bear Run, which is a stream. A run is a sort of a local colloquialism for fast-moving body of water. So Bear Run runs through the nature reserve. It's about 5 miles long, and we also own all of the land from origin to, I guess, the mouth of it as it goes into the Yawkey River. We're located about 70 miles from Pittsburgh, which today is about a 90-minute drive. And since 1963, it's been a program of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, who stewards the historic buildings on the site with a staff of 115 people, of 240 that work for the Conservancy. So the Conservancy itself is interested in the land and the wildlife and the water of Western Pennsylvania, similar to the Nature Conservancy in structure, but specific to the western half of the state. We became a National Historic Landmark ourselves in 1976, and then in 2019 we were one of 8 Frank Lloyd Wright buildings that were inscribed onto UNESCO's World Heritage List, which is a great thing for us. So here you see it in its setting. Lots of land, lots of beautiful trees. This could have been taken yesterday.
Yeah.
Fallingwater was commissioned by Edgar Jonas Kaufmann. You see there on the left with his son Edgar Jr. and his wife Lillian. It was commissioned as a weekend country house for his family and meant to be used year-round. The Kaufmanns were great outdoors people. They liked horseback riding, fishing, and hiking. And wonderful photographs of them enjoying the land around their house as much as the house itself. Frank Lloyd Wright visited Pittsburgh in 1934, in December of that year.
Maybe you could speak up?
Yep, sure, okay. Frank Lloyd Wright visited Pittsburgh in 1934 to meet with the Allegheny County Authority Commission, which was a civic venture. And Edgar Kaufmann himself sat on many of these committees and brought Wright to Pittsburgh as a way of introducing him as a possible architect or engineer consultant on some of these public projects. One of them, which is most fascinating, never got to the design stage, was a planetarium for downtown Pittsburgh. While he was there, of course, Wright made suggestions for most of the buildings he saw. He visited Kaufmann's department store and suggested an addition, or a new office rather, for Edgar Sr., which took on a couple of years later. But he also visited Bear Run. He visited that landscape that we saw there to discuss what Edgar called his lodge. Frank Lloyd Wright
I'll try to get another one.
Frank Lloyd Wright's initial concept for the house was to have something suspended by cables that would go over the run and be connected on either side of the room. So of course, Edgar writes in some recollections later on that we talked and we disagreed. But really, from that moment on, Edgar Kaufmann became more than a client. He actually became one of Wright's great patrons. The department store that I mentioned earlier is Kaufmann's department store, and this was founded in the late 19th century by 4 brothers, German immigrants. Edgar Kaufmann and William Kaufmann were both children of those 4, one of those 4. And so at the age of 28, through some very shrewd business dealings, Edgar Kaufmann became president and director of Kaufmann's department store. So from 1913 till about 1955, which is the year that he died, he really directed what was happening inside of the store. The store itself, with Lillian at his side, was seen as sort of a center of modernity. They were known as tastemakers, art collectors, fashionable people in Pittsburgh. And as I mentioned earlier, that 1934 visit took Wright to the department store and into what was then Edgar Kaufmann's office on the top floor. And he suggested a new office, which was, I guess, sort of the test case for how these two men would work together. Edgar Kaufmann then commissioned him to design a private office, which you see him in here in this photograph. And this was an interesting project in that it was also constructed by Manuel Sandoval, who was an apprentice of Wright's at the time, 1935. And all of the textiles, the furniture, and the carpets in the office were hand-woven by Loya Saarinen, who was the wife of Eliel Saarinen at Cranbrook University. This office then was dismantled, I believe, in the 70s, and spent some time at Pittsburgh in the Carnegie Museum of Art, and now is housed at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where we're anxiously awaiting its reinstallation in their new galleries. Lillian Kaufmann then was just a few years younger than her husband. In 1933, she started working full-time at the department store and took over the top floor, renaming it the Vendôme shops. These were sort of modeled after French department stores that she had seen. Everything was brought in so that a woman who was shopping there could buy everything she needed. I think the tagline on the ad was from her skin out. So it was sort of like a beauty salon, it was cosmetics, it was clothing, it was furnishings, all on one department floor. They had a separate kind of ad campaign and marketing and a brand for it within the department store. You can see very fashionable woman here, and then Edgar Jr., their son, was born in 1910. And so by the time Fallingwater is built, he's in his early 20s. He's gone to Vienna to study painting, wants to be an artist. He comes back to the United States and was given by a friend a copy of Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography, which he wrote in 1932. So he reads this autobiography, thinks it might be an interesting place to go, not necessarily to study architecture, and he moves to Spring Green, Wisconsin to become part of the Taliesin Fellowship in October of 1934. His parents visit a month later. They start discussions about these various projects in Pittsburgh, including a country house. And then within 6 months, Edgar's back in Pittsburgh. He leaves the fellowship and starts working at the department store with his parents, where he's the merchandise manager for home furnishings. This interesting kind of domestic design and domestic industrial design especially leads him to have about an 18-year affiliation with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, first as sort of a researcher on specific exhibitions, and then later as a curator. And at the last 2 years of his tenure there, he was director of industrial design. He's probably most famous for creating what we call the Good Design exhibitions at MoMA from 1950 to 1955. You see a photograph of him here in the upper right with Alexander Gerard, who was brought in to kind of serve as a co-curator. These were displays in the museum of utilitarian objects, of cars. There's, I would say pencil sharpeners, meat slicers, dinnerware, textiles, anything that you could essentially buy through a department store. So that idea of working with the consumer in mind was very advantageous. Then these exhibitions would close and go to the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, again offering people everyday objects for purchase in their homes. For us, he's also probably most important for his biography of the house, which was written in 1985, called Fallingwater, Frank Lloyd Wright Country House. It's his memoir of the book and the commission. Never went out of print, almost 40 years. And it's a really wonderful description of how the house came to be and how the house is carried on after the death of his parents in 1952 and 55. So like I mentioned, he was at Taliesin in 1934. He was there at a great time for his father and his mother to see what was happening in Wright's world. This is post-Depression Frank Lloyd Wright, which means he did not build but 2 or 3 buildings in all of the 20s. He was very interested in other things. He wrote a lot of books. He started the Taliesin Fellowship, and he began working on a utopian project called Broadacre City, and building a model that you see here in its early stages of completion. But this was a 12-foot by 12-foot square model, scale model, of how Frank Lloyd Wright kind of saw a democratic America living and working. You see Frank Lloyd Wright kind of just to the right there of center with the beret on with his head tilted down, and Edgar Kaufmann Jr. on the far left in the white shirt and glasses. So when the Kaufmann parents were visiting here, Wright saw an opportunity to ask his patron for some help. And Wright was able to secure some funding from Edgar Kaufmann to finish this model, and then also gave him a place to display it. So the Kaufmann's department store in Pittsburgh had a floor that they would use for exhibitions. They kind of created these mini versions of World's Fairs and things. So they would bring objects and merchandise from all over the world to sell. And so they set up a display with the Federal Housing Association to display this. And so again, another kind of way of keeping Kaufmann in Wright's circle. And so it's always interesting too, because Edgar Kaufmann is kind of there at the beginning of this discussion about Fallingwater with his parents. And then in 1963, almost 30 years later, he's the one that then donates it to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy as a way of protecting it. And so you see here the exchange of the deed. At the time, the house sat on 1,500 acres of land, so the additional 3,000 or so that we've acquired since then has all been really to kind of create a protection buffer zone around it. But the site, well, I'm just going to say too that I have just a couple images here. So we were doing tours from day one, of course. In 1964, our visitation was about 29,000 a year, and in 2019, before we were closed for the pandemic, we were at about 171,000 people a year. It's a tour program that's has changed. This is a great photo too, because you can see how the wisteria has changed in 60 years of the guest house. But we're still seeing visitors all over the world, all over the country, interested in not only Wright, but in modern architecture itself. But it had to start somewhere. And for us, it started in what was known as Masonic camps that were in southwestern Pennsylvania. And in 1895, this land was acquired by a group and named a Masonic country club on about 135 acres of land. And so later in 1906, it changes hands to another club known as the Syria Masonic Lodge, so they renamed it Syria Country Club. And this is when the site is really seen as kind of a tourist attraction. This is from a series of postcards we have in our collection showing that spot, that waterfall, where Fallingwater would then be constructed about 15 years later. These are both photos from 1921. And then just a local family on the right there, the Woodmansys, who had a photo album of photos of their family visiting the site and picnicking and hiking, and donated these to us in 1992. And then just generally, there were structures on the property before Fallingwater got there, and a lot of them were built by these two Masons organizations. This is a site plan that Edgar Kaufmann commissioned in 1920 when he was thinking about purchasing the property. For about 10 years before that, he was leasing it with the camp buildings to allow a place, fresh air, nature, fresh water, for his store employees to come out. There were about 1,000 people that would come out every year from the department store out of smoggy Pittsburgh and spend a week in the country. So they developed these surveys of the existing buildings where there were sewage lines, where there were any kind of natural rock formations. You see trees marked there. And then a red star is the location now of the Wright house. So you can kind of see next to that star a bridge that goes over Bear Run. And the bridge has changed, the location is not. But if you've been there, you kind of see this frame of reference. All of these structures are now gone. They were all taken down in the 30s and after. And just a couple photos here of kind of what those camp buildings look like. There was a large clubhouse, you see in the upper left there, that was used as a dormitory. When the Kaufmann department store was leasing it was mostly for single shop girls. That was the dining hall, that was the public library, that was the nurse. It's kind of the center of the campus. And then throughout the land, there were small cottages. They were called back to nature cottages. And you can see an example here, one on the right. No plumbing in those, no electrical in those. And the Kaufmanns themselves built their own cabin on the property. This was a kit house from Aladdin. It was a company that made prefabricated cottages, and this was something they purchased through the department store. I want to say it was about $600. And they modified it to add on screen porches on 3 of the sides. And it was sort of sitting on the edge of the property, on the edge of a cliff, so kind of a precursor to having something kind of cantilevered over the ravine. And it was known as the hangover. And the double entendre was intentional. So again, 40 by 40 house that they lived in from 1921 until Fallingwater was completed in 35. And again, no plumbing, no heating, no electrical in this one. So Wright starts working with Kaufmann on designs of the house, and this is the presentation drawing that was completed in 1935, and you can see very dramatically poised over the waterfall. We have in this drawing set about 170 sheets showing everything, electrical, plumbing, all the furniture drawings, and then 2 years later, he creates another series of drawings. There's 40 in this set for a guest house that connects on the north side of the main house and works its way up the hill. So you can kind of see the main house there at the bottom on the left, kind of drawn in silhouette. And this kind of is one of those projects that brings Wright back to the forefront of architecture in the U.S. At the time, the Kaufmanns commissioned him, he was 67. Nobody was really writing about him. Many people thought he had retired or died. But this project gave him another 25 years of work. And before the house was even completed, the Museum of Modern Art came out, had the house photographed, and mounted an exhibition in 1938. A week later, it was on the cover of Time magazine with Wright, talking about him in sort of futuristic terms rather than looking back at Prairie School style architecture and kind of those 19th century views that he was really starting to get, sort of disparaged for. And then as built, this is what the house looks like today. You can see at the bottom of the main house, the curved element in the center is a stepped canopy that connects the main house to the guest house, which is at the top. You can see the swimming pool for the guest house there in the upper right. It's a really wonderful arrangement that allows you to go from the main house to the guest house under cover. It sort of looks like a pergola. As you go up, open on all sides, and until 2010, there was a beautiful oak tree dead center, so you had this wonderful tree canopy of color going over the whole center of the property. But again, you can see how it's kind of impacting the landscape around it. And Wright talks about the house later in 1952. He sits down with Hugh Downs on television and does an interview, and really is sort of philosophical about it and talks a lot about the beauty and the connectedness to nature of this house. So I have a quote there from that interview. I'll just leave up for a second, but it really is the sort of the definition of organic architecture, if you think of it. The house is really connected. It seems like it's growing out of the hillside as well as kind of out of the bedrock of the stream, and then you have it suspended over the air, so you have all the elements kind of working around it. And he prepared for the Kaufmanns and their contractor, Walter Hall, 9 pages of specifications. So the whole house, well, it's really kind of 8 1/5. These are the descriptive, parameters for things like the steel and the stone, the concrete, the paint, window frames, the roofing, all of the terrace waterproofing, the plaster, the hardware, all the electrical specifications. So just to give you a frame of reference, we are doing a project right now, and our architect has put together 400 pages of specifications. So we're dealing with a project where there's a lot of assumptions being made about who's building it. Wright sends a series of apprentices to act as kind of supervisors on the project, so they're essentially translating this stuff for the contractor, who was hiring mostly local labor coming out of the mines, not trained as masons, not trained as carpenters. And so there's a lot of correspondence about what do you mean by this, or send me a sketch of this detail. But it's really wonderful to kind of go back and look to see how some portions of this are very vague, and some of them are very specific. The hardware must be this, but the concrete can be this. It's not kind of set in stone. But the major materials used in the house are the stone, the Pottsville sandstone, which was quarried about 500 feet away from the site of the house. The red steel, red painted steel of the window frames and the door sash. And then we have both reinforced concrete and concrete plaster over lath, and then all of the glass on the interior, and then all of the built-in furnishings over there. I also wanted to just mention too, because the first page of the specifications up there, he makes a point of saying to anybody who was bidding on this project, no natural growths or any features of the site are to be destroyed or changed except one tree cut down as directed. So they had to really work around everything on property. In July 1936, the foundation walls were in place, and 3 tapered reinforced concrete bolsters, as Wright called them, were set into place. So you can see that photograph here. This is again all on top of the waterfall. Stone pier on the left, and then the 3 tapering bolsters there. And then what you see is kind of U-shaped elements at the top there are the reinforcing bars, and those will connect the cantilever to these bolsters. It's not a lot, but it's there. And here's just a photo of that same area of the house, but looking from above, so you can see how it's put together. Still amazes our engineer. And then, as you can see, there's living room cantilevers that put into place, poured in place, and you start seeing some of the architectural elements come to life. This is an opening in the living room that will then accept a staircase going down to the stream, and that's our air conditioning system, essentially. There's a window hatch that pulls back and retracts, allowing cool air to come from the water up into the house. But you can see, I want to point out, especially on these bolsters along the top, where joins the ceiling is a cold joint, what we call it. It's 2 different pores of concrete that create this division between the 2 areas. You'll see some photos of preservation work later on that area in particular. And just a photograph here of the quarry. This is a quarry that had existed before the Kaufmanns took the property, and it was reopened especially to work on the house. This is also an area that's very close to the house, so we spent, I think, 2 summers ago with our landscape interns cleaning up, all of the overgrowth and creating kind of a separate trail near the house, so that visitors that are walking around can actually go back and see some points of the history of the site. We still will pull stones out of there from time to time if we're trying to find something to replace a lost stone or a broken stone. And then I've got a series, 2 photos from a series of about 50 that we have of the construction of the house. These are photographs that were taken by the Kaufmann's department store photographer. So he would come out as directed by Edgar Kaufmann, as well as his secretary, to come out and take notes and then report back. So he was doing this as sort of a part of his job for Kaufmann, but thankfully for us, it's documenting a lot of really wonderful things. One of the issues that I'll talk about in a few minutes is the interior of these stone walls, and you can kind of see as you look around the top edge there, it looks a little rough, and there are actually 2 stone walls with a void between them. So as they were building up the walls, they were just throwing rubble and things into that void. It's now allowing water to travel through the house, like you would not believe. So we're going to be working on a project to fill all of those voids. But this is the kitchen. If you've been to the house, the kitchen window is sort of center there, and the front door, the kitchen door, is right here at the bottom. But all those little ledges, all those little sort of bump outs on the stone wall were all meant to reflect the pattern of the natural stone around the site. And then here you see just a view from the 2nd floor looking up the hill. You can see in the very upper left corner one of those existing camp cottages still in place, and a kind of an outer building, might have been a barn there, and that's the site of the guest house. So that cottage remained up there until 1939 when the guest house replaced it. And then some views here of the stone again, but showing you where the window then would be for the 3rd floor. This is the study for Edgar Kaufmann Jr. You can see next to the fireplace opening there what looks like kind of a vertical line cut into the wall. It's actually a gap that's intentionally put there for the window glass to kind of slide into. So it's an effect that once it's completed makes it look like the glass is coming right out of the side of the house. It's a really wonderful feature. And then lots of great photos of things that now we look back on and are kind of a little terrified of. But this is the roofing process. You can see they've got a fire going there on the other side of the stream. They're warming up asphalt and tarring all the roofs. At the same time, they've got a whole series of flagstones lined up on the bridge there for one of the terraces, and then the master bedroom terrace there is in the process of having its planks put in. So it's a great photograph. We love finding stuff like this because it tells us so much about what's beneath things, what's behind walls, what's under surfaces. And then a great photo here of the Kaufmanns showing the guest house is completed in the back. So this is about a 1940 photograph. One of our favorite quotes from Wright. And the reason I like this photograph so much is that if you look closely, this is 2 years, maybe 3 years into them living there. You can see all of the paint damage. You can see the cracks along the surface of the concrete. Preservation has been an issue at this house since day one. So it's not new. Historic preservation at Fallingwater is not new. It's just how it's been handled. At the time that the Kaufmanns lived there, they were caretakers. Now we have a maintenance team. There's a difference. But it's always sort of good to know that, you know, this has always been there. It probably always will be, but that that there is a history and there is a way of kind of going back in time and looking to see how some of these things were handled and treated. It also looks like much of the paint is gone, so I'm wondering if it's in between the paint, but we don't know. But the climate around us and the environment is really, you know, one of those things we're always dealing with. And the interconnectedness of Fallingwater with its landscape and its site, like I said, is often, you know, what they call the definition of organic architecture. But sometimes nature is also the source of the problem. For us, it's exchange, it's the extreme temperature changes. We get snow and ice, and the next day it could be in the 40s. So these freeze-thaw gaps that happen regularly are always opening up cracks on stone, opening cracks up in mortar. We're susceptible to weather, and this is an event that happened 5 years ago. Just rushing water that comes down. This actually got about 8 feet up the steps that you see there. Didn't enter the house, but took out some artwork that was on the property, and gone the next day. So back to normal low water. So it always seems like we're acting or reacting with nature in some way. Moisture and humidity and condensation affects the surfaces of our concrete and the paint finish on the house. Not to mention it's sometimes uncomfortable to be in the house. So what we do then when we are kind of preparing preservation projects is do a lot of research and experimentation, and always trying to kind of learn things from the building, but then also leave the building as intact as possible. We don't just completely take something out. We do kind of skillful surgical maneuvers on the house. This looks very bad. And this is really, this is one of those rolled edges of the roof on the 3rd floor. This is the result of water damage, but it's a portion of the building where there's no steel reinforcing bars going through it. Those curved features of the house are all hand molded, so there's not a rebar going down the middle of it. So once water starts getting in there and freezing and exploding them, they start falling to the ground. What Jeff is holding in his left hand is a piece of the flashing material from the roof that would come over that edge, which has sort of kept everything together. Now we're having to deal with a product that we use for flashing. This is probably 15 or 16 years old, so we have warranties that are expiring. We're always looking for a new product. So we start looking at spots on the building that the visitors don't see, which is really in the back of the guest house, to do trials, to do experiments using different materials. And this was a liquid flashing product we put on in 2 sections of that rolled roof edge on the guest house in 2018. And we like it for a lot of reasons. It can sort of just go right over the new roofing material and create kind of a seamless surface there so water can't get in. We can also tint it to match the paints and colors so that we know what we can tint over here. Speaking of paint, we do a lot of paint testing. This is back 2002 when we were really looking at finding a new paint system. We did tests, about 120 of these, different areas of the building, where we knew the weather hit hard or the sun hit hard. They were vertical, they were horizontal, there were primers and paint finishes, there were oil-based, latex-based, interior, exterior. And we sort of let the elements kind of take over for about a year and a half. And then just kept track of all of the results. You can see here it's even the number of coats, 1 coat versus 2 coats, flat versus eggshell, all of that material. We have a lot of windows at Fallingwater, so we have a lot of ultraviolet light coming into the house. And also around the time we were doing the paint test, we were looking at ways to diminish the effects of UV on our furniture, on our fabrics, our artwork. We looked at putting tinting on the windows, which you can see. We did a sample of on this window, and you can see the color change between the super clear glass that Wright specified that we continue to use at the top and the bottom, and then this sort of gray shade that comes over and into the rooms, and it just changes everything. So that stayed on again as a test, and then removed, and we no longer tint our windows. And we're doing a lot of order samples all the time. These are little sort of hockey puck-sized discs of mortar. We were looking at a portion of one of our terrace walls where you could see the color of the mortar change from left to right. You could tell that over the years, it just mixed it differently, and there was never a consistent color. And so one of our maintenance guys came up with the idea of kind of creating a tinted mortar and just kept track of the amount of coloring versus all the other elements that are used to make it. And these are for vertical walls, and we don't have a separate type of mortar mix for the stone floors and the terraces. So all of this stuff gets photographed, documented, tested. We keep good documentation on all of it, and then kind of proceed forward. And sometimes the work that we do, this was a very small hole in the wall, that became a very large hole in the wall. And so we take it as an opportunity to kind of learn. And Roger Humbert on the right there is on our maintenance crew. John Lambert on the left is a masonry and concrete consultant that we bring in from time to time. And when we saw what was happening, we took all the paint and the sort of the outer layer of plaster, we saw that there was a lot of patching happening, and we had this sort of philosophical, do we now start removing it all, or do we bring it all back and just patch the parts that were affected? So we decided to remove as much as we could, but what it gave us was kind of insight into the interior of these plaster and lath walls. So this is a steel lath system, paper insulation, and then just plaster over top of it. So we didn't do anything with the insulation. We cut out the lath and put new metal lath in, tied it all together, and then just replastered the whole thing. We found a hidden light fixture inside there that was covered up. So, kept it hidden, but knew that it was there, took pictures. So the house is always sort of telling us stories too as we go through. I mentioned water being one of our big problems there, and a few years ago we did a really focused water test, saturation test on the chimney mast, which goes up the full height of the house. There are 5 flues in that chimney mast. Water gets in a variety of ways and travels from east to west, not just up and down. So we brought in an engineering team to conduct a series, and here's just one showing saturating the rooftops above a particular room, and then just the side of the chimney mast there is running water for 45 minutes or an hour, turning it off, and then just watching it come out of other spots of the house. Fascinating. This is just a project we did last year, which was, again, kind of that project I mentioned earlier about trying to go in and fill in these voids of grout. This is a stone pier inside of the guest house swimming pool. Our pool leaks, and we think it's all this water in the pool that's actually coming up through the stone and then out onto the surrounding terrace. So we took an opportunity to do a really simple and non-destructive evaluation. They call it an NDE, where we didn't need to have scaffolding, we didn't need to have a lot of equipment. We could just empty the pool and stand there and do these tests and And so they're probing into the mortar joints to see how deep the void is, and then taking a scope camera in there and photographing the void to understand how big it is. And so it's, again, really fascinating to learn how these things were constructed. And our stone floors on the interior. This is something where it's one of those projects where it's almost better left to just keep things the way they were. And ever since the 30s, we've been waxing the floors with Johnson's wax, Plaza Wax. Lloyd Wright has built Johnson Wax, a wonderful building and house, and so this is always the specification. We still do it, and unfortunately, due to all of the rough stone, the best and easiest way to remove it is by hand. So every 3 years, we get a crew on their hands and knees and remove all of the wax and reapply it again. And then more recently, even still, is just kind of embracing new technology for us, and a lot of it has been digital. And this was a series of there's 2 photographs showing a laser scanning process that we've done on the house in 2017 and 2018. Once around the exterior of all the buildings, and then the second pass was all the interior spaces. And this was done by our preservation architect. It took about 5 days in each cycle to place these little dots and sort of check marks along the house, and photographing everything and stitching it together. And what's really wonderful is it can get down to a 1/16 of an inch. So we can find things on the underside of a cantilever that we can't see unless we're erecting scaffolding and going up there and looking at it. So we're given very interesting reports and suggestions on how we can keep using this, and I'll talk later how we're using it now. But I wanted to kind of wrap up with recent projects. I'm sorry, there's a photograph of those targets on the outside of the house. It's like an art installation. But I wanted to talk about a couple of projects that we recently completed. This one for the foundation bolsters was just almost completed last week. But this was a project that began in 2013. We'd started seeing historic cracks showing up on those bolsters. That hole joint that I mentioned, crack was starting to appear again. And we brought in an engineering team who affixed crack and tilt meters to the surfaces of the concrete. So they epoxied them on, and they would measure if there was any change, tilting, or any change to the thickening or the widening of the cracks. And had those on for about 15 months or so. This is just going back to the drawing, you can see the bolsters there under the house. Wright had initially wanted them to be kind of streamlined, tiered in that 30s way. They weren't, they were just smooth finish. But this is a photograph of one of those bays, and you can see here again, house connecting to land. But some of the challenges that you have of working in a space like this. This is the bay that's right at the top of the waterfall. And so the crack meters that were epoxied were removed in 2015, and we installed, this is our engineer, John Maddy out here, installing threaded rod into the concrete walls. And the threaded rod had a little dimple on the outer edge, and it was sort of a low-tech version of the same thing, measuring the cracking and the tilting, but you can see with less of an impact on the house, those kind of white splotches are the epoxy residue that's left on the house. John's method of doing it was much easier. And so we put in these threaded rods kind of above and around certain points where the existing meters were already there. And then our crew can go in and using digital caliper go in and take those measurements. We've never seen anything more than 1/100th of an inch of movement. So we figured there's that hole joint crack, it's at an angle, but you can see how visual it is, or how large it is. So after a certain point, we were measuring these monthly, then quarterly, and then semi-annually, and then we just determined it's time to do the repair. And this repair started in about 2019 with just test patches You can see the gray square there is where we removed the outer layer of paint and stucco to reveal that crack that's still there. You can see kind of patching over the years. It's a really kind of almost a oversaturated flash, so you see the paint in real life is the same color, but you can see where it was constantly being covered over, painted over. There's that cold line, that cold joint line at the top there. And John's firm put together a proposal to actually cover those cracks with bands of flexible metal mesh. It's almost like gauze, medical gauze that you kind of wrap around. But it would allow the building, if there was any flexibility, to kind of move separately and keep those cracks closed. You then re-stucco over the whole thing and everything looks kind of seamless. So this was a project we started in May of 2021. This is the crew kind of cutting into the surface of the stucco there where those bands are going to be placed. This is that same wall we looked at earlier with the test patch. This is with all of the material, the stucco removed from the areas that we're going to be putting the banding. I mentioned earlier we try not to remove any more material than we have to, so the kind of yellow sections and stripes are the concrete that's staying and the stucco that's staying. You notice it's all done at night. It's another great thing. I mean, we are doing all this work while we're still doing tours. So we do the loud work, we do the messy work at night. We get our construction crew to come in and do the work overnight, so that by the time visitors come in at 8:30 in the morning, there's no sign of any work being done. Filled all those cracks with epoxy, got them all leveled out. And then here's just a photo of the application of the mesh. And it's sort of like, almost like paper mache. I think it's like a wet fabric that goes on and it's put into a bed of its own kind of mortar mix, and then put another layer of mortar over it and it just solidifies onto the surface. And there's just a close-up of the mesh kind of laying there in the sun. And then our maintenance crew comes through and does the finishing work on this stuff. So this is Jake Miller, who's part of our team. And you can see the textural difference between that new product on the top and then kind of what the existing concrete surface looks like. So this is all got to be smoothed out before we put stucco on. And just last week they were finishing up the painting, so you can see even painting under the house is challenging. You're still at the top of the waterfall. And there's just a photo from a couple days ago, how it all looks. At the same time we're doing this work, we're doing another project on the bridge, which spans Bear Run, and same contractor, same crew that's helping us, but a different type of project. This was addressing spalling of falling concrete that was landing in the water. This was a kind of a serious situation for us because Bear Run was designated an exceptional value stream by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which means it's the cleanest water in the state. So anything falling into it, at a certain point you got to start reporting it. And we were going down quite often to retrieve concrete from the water. I wanted to go back and kind of look historically to see what this bridge looked like. This was a bridge that Wright designed and was constructed during the time the house was built, but it replaced just sort of a wooden, bridge that went over the stream. So Wright's got some engineering in this. There's rebar, there's stone abutments on each corner. And what we noticed looking at the photography was the bridge that was existing up until May of 2021, which is on the right, is missing this little flare at the bottom, which showed up in a 1936 photograph. So our understanding is Wright came in and something displeased him about that, and he had the crew knock it all down and rebuild it. But they reused the same rebar. So there's used rebar in this bridge. We spent a good amount of time from probably 2015 to 2017 doing a lot of documentation and kind of monitoring the bridge. The photo on the left shows you the deck surface of the bridge. That itself is relatively new. It was replaced in 1964 and is more in line with what you'd have on a highway bridge. The parapet walls, then the vertical walls on the upstream and downstream side do not connect to that deck, so we're able to do all of our work to those two parapets without doing any damage to the horizontal surface. You see there's built-in lighting, so there's electrical going through there. This is also the main path of tours. So all of the tours going back and forth from the start to the finish of the tour across this bridge. We had to keep it open for our shuttle bus. We had to keep it open in case an ambulance had to get up there. And so we came up with kind of an ingenious way to do it. On the right, you'll see the stone abutments from the level of the stream looking up. Lots of repointing had to be done to those too, so that was also part of the project. But here you see kind of what the bridge was doing, in that just big chunks were kind of falling in, and this was again part of the freeze thaw, part of the age of the material that was being used to patch it. Very unsightly. We could patch it every year, it would fall down again. So we decided that at some point it wasn't worth continuing to repair material. We wanted to get it all kind of scraped off and get an understanding of the concrete. And this is just a close-up view of again, these rounded edges at the bottom. But you can see where it just sort of scales off in large, kind of 1 inch thick chunks. You see some nice corroded rebar there in the upper left, always good to see. And then the underside or the backside of the bridge, you see the deck at the top, and then this sort of surface here that looks like cracking paint, but it's actually the stucco that's starting to peel off. Our engineer suggested using a cathodic protection system to kind of help, stop all of that spalling by actually sort of electrifying the rebar within. And so, of course, then we had to determine how much rebar was in there. Right, left us no drawings for this bridge. So this is a consultant that came in to do kind of an X-ray of sorts to try to look at all of the rebar within. And in the end, we decided the concrete is too far gone. We realized that most of the stone that's used in the bridge is round, smooth river rock, not jagged granite, so things just would fall and never kind of stick or tack onto each other. So the next step was then to replace the two walls, and again, doing this during tour season. So we have 1 day a week where we're closed for tours, which is Wednesday, and our contractor, the same contractor working in the bolsters, now is trying to think about scaffolding and working on that bridge without impacting the very clean water beneath. So this is just a photograph of just the dramatic photograph of the scaffolding pieces coming in on a Wednesday, and you can see our narrow gravel path there. All the vehicles have to move in and out. Lots of challenges. Again, work done at night. And those steel members that you saw on the truck there were now suspended from the bridge using these hooks. I always said it kind of looks like Christmas tree ornaments or earrings or something. But each one of them is lowered. There's men in the bottom kind of directing it, so there's no equipment or anything going into the water. And then by morning, this is what it looked like. And threaded rod was then inserted into those. It made it all rigid. They could set a platform up on it, walk across it, and then at the top you have this great scaffolding system that was all sort of held in place by those beams that are now resting on the abutments on either side. Kind of looked like a little Richard Serra sculpture. This is from the terrace. I always kind of thought it's better than looking at the pole scaffolding. This is kind of rusting to a Cherokee colored red. And then again, having to bring the visitors through this space. So our guide staff was all trained to talk about what's going on. We would send out weekly announcements about what you were seeing, the photographs showing. And so people got more and more interested in it, not really, essentially realizing or caring that they're in the middle of a construction and of zone, but everything beyond the plywood was on view to them. We didn't hide anything from them. Once we started demolition, then you can see the effect of that river rock. It just crumbles like I don't know what. But it's non-structural anymore. It's just powder, and this is just a few taps of the jackhammer on this. You can also see the rebar coming up again, probably about 18 inches apart, and we want it 6 or 7 inches apart. And putting new stainless steel rebar in there in its place. So build it better than it was, but using the same materials. And then just some details of the abutment and how that bridge kind of locked into those stones. And then actually bringing the concrete to the site was a challenge. So this is 2 concrete trucks backing up and driving for about a half a mile down a hill on a gravel road in the dark. And then this thing comes out of the top of it, the big hose. It's magic. And then it just pours it right into the form. So you see kind of the concrete there, and now they're really packing it in and vibrating it, and making sure it's sculpted. You can see the close up there of the scaffolding. And by the end of the day, they had taken those cardboard frames off, and they were able to go in and start doing some of the hand sculpting that we typically do on those corners to get that nice sharp 45-degree angle there on the corner. And then it just sits and cures for a month. Come back and put stucco on it. Close up there. So the last project I'm going to talk about is really just the one that's coming up, and this is a 3-year-long project. We started working on the planning for this in 2019, and a lot of the projects that you saw earlier kind of feed into this. There are these sort of small experiments and product testing that we've done on smaller scales that will now be kind of expanded into a larger preservation master plan and specification plan for the house. So we'll have been doing an update to the 1999 plan, which is the one on the left, by the same architect, using the same engineer. So we have great institutional history at Fallingwater. Working then 20 years later to develop just sort of a reassessment of the house and updating all of these building systems. It will cover roofing, concrete, stone, glass, and then some of the wood conservation as well. But if you remember that project 20 years ago was the one that made the news, and it's the one that people still kind of remember and talk about, which was that the cantilevers were deflecting, and there was some urgency in saving the house from falling into the water, which it never was going to, but it did kind of bring, at least in importance for the Frank Lloyd Wright community and for us, preservation matters. We always kind of say that. But this is a very impactful preservation project. Our next one will be less so, but just as dramatic. We'll be having scaffolding going up the chimney mass, and then the whole south side, which is the visible side of the house, starting in the spring. There's our architect, Pamela Jerome, on the left, and John Matteo, again, our engineer on the right. They've been working with this house over 30 years, and it's great for them to kind of see this progression keep happening, but then also so much, we have so much confidence in them because they know everything that's going on. We don't have to kind of retrain a team every time we have a big restoration project. They come with younger architects, which is always great. So this is Pamela's team from her office. They're doing a building survey. These are the people that are bringing in the technology side of things. Stephanie Gerard in the upper left is Belgian and has been working with our digital photography that we took in 2017, 2018, And we approached the firm that digitized the Notre Dame roof after the fire. So as a World Heritage Site, they're a World Heritage Site. We thought, okay, these guys kind of are going to be very sensitive to the project. So she approached them, and they developed a whole series of drawings using that photography to get these sort of exacting. And these are better drawings than Frank Lloyd Wright's, because these are the drawings of the building as it actually is. Where Wrights are, very often not reality. And then just beautiful kind of X-ray shots looking through the house. What's always great here is that the doors aren't always in line. If you look at Wright's drawing, perfectly in line. There's these sort of bits and bobs. You see the living room fireplace there on the bottom floor, and then this is the reverse, the other side of the chimney mass. So these are just, again, another tool for us to use in preservation, and we'll start using them more and more. So we'll leave you with another beautiful autumn shot in our Job Lipschitz sculpture there in the bottom right. I'll stop there. If you have any questions, happy to take them.
The seasons affect you. Can you do this work in the winter, or are you limited to summer?
We do interior work in the winter.
Okay.
So it's, for us, winter is primarily January, February, and the first half of March. And that's our season. So we start tapering off tours in the end of November, and then we're open the entire week of Christmas and New Year's. And then we're closed for tours. So that allows us to get inside the house and move things out and work on things like stripping the floors. But seasons affect us. We get to a certain temperature point, we can't paint anymore. December's been a little bit warmer the last few years, so we are able to paint. It's almost week by week kind of look at things.
What sort of heating is there in the house?
It's a 2-sweater house. So 2 sweaters. It was built with radiator heating. And then every bedroom and the living room had a fireplace. The guest house has a fireplace. Right now, we're only burning the fireplace that's in the living room, and that's usually only when tours are coming through. So essentially, it's radiators and space heaters. Yeah, sweaters. Yeah.
So Scott, this is pretty expensive stuff, right? I mean, it's not paid for by admissions to the tours.
Not at all.
How is it financed?
Well, we're a private nonprofit. We're not a state site. We're not. World Heritage doesn't come with a $1 million check. We do a lot of grant writing. We do a lot of the local foundations are approached. We have a new site, Drop Your Change box there that gets us quite a lot of money every year. But it's the tickets, it's the grants, especially the local grants. We've used our Save America's Treasure card already with the project from 20 years ago. So it's dependent on fundraising.
Yeah. So sitting a project like a bridge, what would that?
I don't always factor in our labor. So just knowing what the bridge and the bolsters together were just under $500,000. And a lot of that was local foundations and grants. So our crew, our maintenance crew's labor doesn't factor into that. PPG is generous and donates the paint.
Oh.
So things like that it's again a relationship that we build. We have a piece of paper from Frank Lloyd Wright that says you must use PPG paint. Window glass is the same. We have a program that we set up probably about 10 years ago now. It's called a Window Legacy Program, where you can adopt a window. This adoption fee then goes into a kind of an endowment for steel conservation. All these little things.
So I know you said that you had experimented with putting some sort of filling on the windows to protect from UV. What kind of problems do you get from the sun exposure in the summer?
The windows, what we did replace We don't use the tinting anymore. What we did was we replaced the 1/4-inch plate glass that was originally there with a 1/4-inch thick sandwich glass. And that's, again, using the PPG, the same glass, but in an 1/8-inch thickness rather than a 1/4-inch thickness. And then there's a layer in between of a DuPont product called Sentry Glass that was designed as a safety glass. It's a rubber plasticky product, but it has the benefit of being UV, there's a UV rating to it. So we basically sort of created this, it's almost like a grilled cheese sandwich. You just kind of melt all three of them together, and then you can cut it just like 1/4-inch glass. So that's what we're using now in all the windows. We still do annual wood conservation, so we're coming in and dealing with the effects of UV on woodwork. Artwork is better because we can put conservation glazing on the front of a drawing. Paintings aren't so much affected by it, but sculpture's not affected by it. So textiles are kind of sacrificial at this point. Bedspreads are not historic, so the bedspreads that are used now are 5 years old. And throw pillows we design in such a way that we can turn them inside out, reverse them, and do all sorts of things. So we get creative with it. Nothing, as far as rugs is original in the house. So those are all replicas, still the same Moroccan, artisans that are making them, but they're from 2015. They're not from 1935. So. It's a house that's interesting because the Kaufmanns wanted it. They kind of left us with certain directives for things, and one of them was to not make the house feel like a museum. So we don't have ropes and stanchions and things up there. We don't have a lot of signage and label. We have no signage and labels in the house. So you really are feeling like you're coming in to visit the family.
You and several thousand others.
Yeah. A house designed for 3 people that sees 171, and you never know.
You kind of referred to this, but did Mr. Wright leave detailed instructions for how to make the house when adjustments needed to be made? Did he leave really detailed instructions about what he wanted to see, or does he leave it up to you folks to more or less interpret what he?
Mr. Wright didn't. Mr. Kaufmann did. Mr. Kaufmann Jr. did. So Edgar dies in 1989, and so for that almost 25 years between 1963 and his death, he's acting kind of as a de facto curator. So he comes through and will arrange furniture, take things out, put new art in, take old art out, that kind of thing. That was part of the deal with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. And we have, his mother is very specific about flowers in the house. We have live flowers in the house. So we have certain rules about the flowers, only one color per vase, cut to 3 different lengths. So we still do this every Thursday morning. The species have changed over time because now they have to be a little bit hardier, but they're not picking them out of the cutting garden every day and changing flowers. But those are the kinds of things that we still kind of abide by. How some things are displayed also go back to Edgar Jr. had done an article for Italian Architecture magazine and had the entire house photographed in 1962. And because that was his kind of curatorial eye on those photographs, his partner Paul Mayan did the photography. So it was all kind of in-house. We use that kind of still as the standard of where things should be arranged and how things are displayed, because that's kind of his last placement of those sort of things. But
Can it be rented for events?
it cannot.
I thought I had been told it couldn't.
We have a barn. we have 20 other buildings on the property. They took a tour. They took a tour. There's a difference. They paid for this. The house just can't handle it. So what we do is then we have the dairy farm that the Kaufmanns had, which is just outside the entrance, has been converted into an event space. So that's typically where we have event. You might come over here and do tours and that sort of thing, but if there was a dinner, wedding reception, then come back and forth. But that's one of 20 other buildings that we have on the property other than the house. Back row.
Is there any sharing with the Kentucky Knob?
We do, yeah. We share, we use, there's another site called Polymath Park, which is kind of in the opposite direction of Kentucky, but Kentucky has got a shared history with us in that Edgar had helped them with furniture selection and with some of, getting into the Wright's office, just getting him to, by the time the Hagen family is building their house, he's much busier. And it was harder to kind of get commissions, so Edgar helped in that regard. Now they're a separate entity. They're still a privately owned house, but they function as a private site. The other property is called Polymath Park, which is in Acme, Pennsylvania, and there are two houses by Peter Bernson, who was an apprentice of Wright's, and then the owners of that property have moved to Frank Lloyd Wright buildings that were about to be demolished. They saved them, dismantled them, rebuilt them. So there's 4 Wrightian houses on that property. And we work with them more closely because we help them with ticketing and some of the logistics of operating in that regard. But those houses you can sleep in, you can stay, you can have events. Yeah. Do you have a question?
But did he leave like any specifications for the future of the house? Like he did at Samara, but didn't he like design furniture for the future?
Oh,
Yeah. Did he leave anything like that?
Frank Lloyd Wright or Mr.
Frank Lloyd Wright, yeah.
No, the house was done and done.
It was
So
done and done.
yeah, they came back, I think they came back a couple of times for advice. No, the relationship didn't end.
Yeah.
He went on to act as this kind of consultant for Edgar Sr. in the Pittsburgh world. So we're going to mount an exhibition next year on these unrealized projects for Pittsburgh, unrealized projects for Fallingwater, and animate them into 3D, so you actually are seeing them built and go through them. I want to say there were 9, 10 of them, and then there were others for the Hagen family at Kentucky that were never realized. So, but once the guest house was done, I think he was brought back just if there was a problem or something. I know the woodwork warped the first year that it was in the house, so Wright was acting kind of as the intermediary between them and the carpenter.
And that was true for us as well. He designed everything at one time.
Right.
They just couldn't make it all
afford it
happen.
all, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
So that question about, I guess I have was, I've heard of humidity problems with the house, and then you talked about the natural air cooling. I want to know, do you have problems with the floor and condensation? We tried to go without air
Johnson's
conditioning.
wax?
No, we didn't. But, we tried to go without air conditioning,
Yeah.
and we couldn't handle it because of the condensation on the
Yeah.
floor. Because the floor was a cold sink.
Okay.
Maybe the floors here are more flexible.
Yeah, they're nice, they're thick stones, I mean, they're pretty,
Yeah.
but they're, they're well, I'm not calling kind of any slip
Yeah, you
falls
would,
or
yeah,
anything.
you would know. I mean,
Um,
ours was just,
And we don't have condensation on the inside of window glass, for instance, either. That's always something that you think of, if you have an air-conditioned space at some point, you start getting condensation. We have condensation on the underside of all the cantilevers that cleans. So that's just coming up from the stream and hitting that one concrete. Any other questions?
Just one.
Okay.
That story about, Wright quickly putting this together when apocryphal.
A myth and a legend.
I know. It's a nice story.
that's Kaufmann. Edgar wrote it, Edgar Jr., right?
No, Edgar Toffel.
Oh, it was Edgar Toffel.
So there's a wonderful anecdote from Edgar Toffel, who was one of the apprentices that worked with this, with the Kaufmanns on this, that Kaufmann kept asking where the drawings are, I want to see my house, and Wright kept kind of, yeah, they're coming. And then he gets a phone call from Mr. Kaufmann saying, I'll be there in 2 hours, I'm driving from Milwaukee. And so Wright supposedly just threw this drawing out and designed the whole house, shaking it from his sleeve, I think is the phrase. and a band of loyal apprentices witnessed it.
Pencil sharpening.
Pencil sharpen,
Yes.
just one person just handing him sharpened pencils. So I don't know, it's one of those houses, he visited the site, he had time to think about the site. I think it's not, stacked trays, it's not the Guggenheim. There's not a lot of complex engineering in there. But I think it did, if it did happen quickly, it was very sketchy. It wasn't that presentation drawing that we saw. It was probably just shapes. Yeah.
The apprentices would run off with it. And well, they went to lunch.
Great. Well, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Great.